Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Michael Lind. I'm the Policy Director of the Economic Growth Program at the New America Foundation. It's our particular privilege today to be hosting McKinsey Global Institute in its McKinsey and Company in its report Growth and Renewal in the United States, Retooling America's Economic Engine. This report, which is launched today with this event, looks at the importance of productivity growth in contributing to the American standard of living and to the growth of employment and prosperity in the United States in the years and decades to come, something that is central to public debate. We're particularly pleased to be hosting McKinsey because of their reputation for having an empirical, fact-driven approach to the analysis of issues of the American economy and the global economy at a time when these issues tend to be polarized and dominated by ideology. In addition to the report which is published today and which is now available on McKinsey.com, Growth and Renewal in the United States, Retooling America's Economic Engine, James Manyika and Vikram Malhotra have an op-ed in today's Wall Street Journal, Productivity and Growth, the Enduring Connection. So those of you in the audience here, and also our much larger online viewing audience, we welcome you as well. If you're interested, please go to McKinsey.com and to the Wall Street Journal to get McKinsey's take on this important issue. Here's how the morning will work. We're asking James Manyika, Director of McKinsey and Company, to talk about Growth and Renewal, their new report. Following that, Anish Chopra, the Chief Technology Officer of the White House, who will be arriving shortly, will give his take on the report and on the subject in general. We'll follow that with a brief question and answer period. After that, we'll ask James to be joined on stage by Lenny Mendoza, Director of McKinsey and Company, and by Cheryl Schwinninger, Director of the Economic Growth Program here at New America, for a conversation that I will moderate. So let's get started. I'd like to welcome James Manyika, Director of McKinsey Global Institute. He's previously directed McKinsey's Technology Institute and is a trustee of the Aspen Institute and the World Affairs Council of California, among other organizations. Please join me in welcoming James Manyika.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming. There's a little bit of an echo. I don't know if everybody can hear me well. Thank you for coming. We're quite excited about what we see in the medium and the long run for the U.S. economy. But I thought I would start with a little bit of context here, because I think it's important to keep in mind what has happened to the U.S. economy and the challenges that we face. Employment is clearly on the minds of everybody, and I think it is quite important to keep remembering the fact that if you look at where we are with employment, we've actually lost twice as many jobs as any other recession before, and even up until as recent as December and January, we still have roughly 7 or so million jobs below the peak of where we were just before the recession. So jobs and employment continue to be quite important. And I think it's quite sobering, actually, to, again, put this in context, which is if we think about what it's going to take to get back to reasonable levels of employment, it's actually going to be quite a challenge. And just the math on this is quite striking. So if you think about, if you look on this chart, if you look at the number of jobs that have to be created every month, and how long it will then take to close the gap to get back to reasonable, if you like, levels of unemployment, which are typically taken to be 5% or less, it's going to take quite a while. So if we create jobs at the rate of, call it 200,000 jobs, net new jobs a month, it's going to take us up to about 2017. That's just the math of it. And it's also important to keep that number in mind, 200,000, which is, have we done anything like that in previous periods? And we did do that in the early 80s, was the time when we were able to actually create jobs at that rate. So it's important to keep kind of these sobering facts in mind. Another important thing to keep in mind that's going on, obviously lots of concerns about levels of debt that have accumulated in all parts of the economy. What we're showing here is basically the total debt in the economy, not just government debt, but also household and corporate and other debt. As you can see, it roughly adds up to roughly 287% of GDP. The good news is that we've begun the process of deleveraging. As you can see, most of the categories, with the exception here of government debt, but most of the other categories from financial institutions at the bottom in the dark blue are deleveraging, so are households, and you also see that, in fact, non-financial business is also being deleveraging. So the process of deleveraging has actually begun, which is good news. Now, as we start to shift, as we think through to the long term, it's important to also realize that in the end, it's really real GDP growth that actually matters. And in some ways, you could argue it actually matters more than what might happen if we had a double-dip recession. What we're showing here is the blue line basically shows, if the trend in sort of GDP growth, if we follow historical rates of growth and assume that we can, that continues unabated. The dark blue shows what would happen if, in fact, we had a double-dip recession and then continued that trend. The orange is what happens if we didn't even have a double-dip recession but had a percentage less growth below trend. So what you'll see from this is that over time, the effects from a point of view of wealth creation and prosperity are much more stark in a world in which we have lower growth. In some ways, in the long run, that actually matters more than if we had a double-dip recession and then got back to trend, as you can see from this chart. So this is what has made us sort of shift as we think to the medium term, which is to say, even though we recognize the immediate challenges, we want to keep in mind what is it going to take to reignite growth and renewal overall in the economy. So we've been doing quite a bit of work at the McKinsey Global Institute, looking at issues that have to do with how to think about and deal with the drag from the recession, but also how to reignite growth and renewal in the economy. And we're tackling a variety of topics, but what I want to focus on today is the productivity engine and what we've been thinking about is the productivity imperative for the U.S. economy. I'm going to be making about 4 or 5 key points in the course of the next 20 minutes related to productivity. The first one is that productivity growth really matters. In fact, I probably should repeat that. Productivity growth really matters. Now, you might ask, why does it matter? We've got so much else to deal with in the economy. Why are we talking about productivity? Well, let me illustrate with a few things. First of all, if you look at how we get our GDP growth in the economy, we've actually come to rely a lot more on productivity gains, much more than anything else. So what this chart shows, if you go back to, say, the 60s or the 70s, and you looked at what was driving and contributing to real GDP growth, roughly 65% in the 70s, 65% of our real GDP growth was coming from increases in workforce and labor participation rates, and only about 35% coming from productivity gains. We were benefiting at the time from the baby boomers starting to work, women entering the workforce, and a whole set of demographic advantages that actually contributed enormously to GDP growth. Contrast that with where we are today. If you look at the 2000s, for example, we now rely on, for our GDP growth, 80% of that comes from productivity gains, because we're only now getting about 20% growth and contribution from labor participation rates. So today, for real GDP growth, we rely 80%. We get 80% of that from productivity gains. And if you look forward, that only gets more stark, partly because we no longer get the benefits from labor participation changes. We're largely tapped out in terms of increases in the labor force. We're not fully tapped up, but I'll come back to that in a second. In the participation rates of women and seniors in the economy, we'll get a little bit of bump from that. But for the most part, we now rely, and will continue to rely even more so, on productivity gains for real GDP growth. And I think, again, it's important to keep this in the context of what all this means and what GDP growth. So if there's this strong linkage between productivity gains and real GDP growth, it's important to keep in mind what this means for overall wealth and prosperity in the economy. What we show here is if you take somebody, and this is at different cohort groups, somebody who was born in say, 1960, and you think about how have they benefited over a 40-year period in terms of growth in wealth and prosperity in terms of in GDP per capita terms. They've probably experienced the highest multiplier effect over time. Contrast that with somebody born in 2000. If you looked at in a world in which we don't have the productivity gains. So what this means is if we don't have the productivity gains which translate to GDP growth, the wealth and prosperity prospects for younger generation are much worse than they were for previous generations. So this is really, really important. So if we think about, so what's the productivity growth that's required to sustain kind of the wealth and prosperity that the U.S. economy has come to experience? If you look at what we've done historically, so in the 2000s, productivity growth rates have averaged roughly 1.6% compared to, say, in the 1970s, where it was only 1.1%. If you look at, whereas in the 1960s, we probably experienced the highest productivity growth at the time, which is roughly 2.2%. But keep in mind, as I said before, then we didn't rely as much on productivity gains. So if you try and think about, okay, so how much do we need in terms of productivity gains to sustain the different levels of prosperity that we require? If you say, well, we want to maintain the historical GDP, 1.7% GDP growth per capita, which is a reasonable expectation to have, then that says we need productivity gains of roughly 2.1% annually going forward. If you say, no, we actually want to maintain a level of the historical overall GDP growth that we've had in the last while, then you'd say, which is roughly 2.8% in terms of GDP growth, then we require productivity gains of roughly 2.3%. However you look at it, these are quite high. Either one of these is quite a high bar of what we're going to have to deliver in productivity gains, and we haven't really done anything close to that except in the 60s. So it's quite a daunting challenge. I guess we could always take comfort in the we're not alone kind of view of the world. If you look at what does this look like for other countries, you'll find that most advanced economies actually have a similar challenge. And in fact, in that sense, the U.S. doesn't have the starkest challenge. You look at the EU 15. They have a much tougher demographic challenge, which is they no longer get hardly any contributions from labor participation rates because of the demographic makeup of the European economy. So to sustain their GDP growth rates that they've had historically, recently, they'd need a bump up of roughly 59% in productivity gains to sustain their GDP growth rates of recent periods. Japan, on the other hand, probably has the starkest challenge because they have a particularly challenged demographic profile of any of the advanced economies, and they need a massive jump in productivity gains if they're going to sustain GDP growth rates. China, on the other hand, is actually an interesting case because demographically, they actually don't have a great demographic profile. However, because of their growth rates and the changes that are still happening in the economy, the productivity growth that they need isn't quite as large. So for the U.S., that's not to say we don't have a daunting challenge. It's still a pretty tough challenge to grow. GDP growth is at roughly 34%, a jump of 34% in GDP growth over time. Productivity matters for another reason too, which is that it's quite striking how the most competitive countries also tend to be the most productive countries. And this, by the way, is also true even at the company level. So we do a lot of work even looking at how companies operate, and you find the same correlation, which is the most productive companies tend to also be the most competitive companies. So productivity also matters for competitive reasons. And especially now in a global economy where many sectors are becoming globally tradable, goods and products and services can now be traded back and forth. So unless you are a very productive economy, it's actually quite hard to also be competitive if you're not being productive. So productivity also matters for competitive reasons. So hopefully I haven't depressed everybody too much. But let me make another point, which is often, we think, quite misunderstood, which is that there's a perception out there that productivity is, kills jobs or destroys jobs. We find that that's actually empirically just not true, if you just look at the facts. So let me show why that is the case. We went back and said, well, let's just look at the empirical evidence of what has been the history of productivity and jobs over time. And we went back literally 80 years, all the way back to 1929, to try and look at empirically at the national level what is the evidence of what happens between jobs and productivity. And what you find, and let me start on the right, if you take 10-year rolling periods in that 80-year period, and you say, when have we had instances when we've had both increasing employment and increasing productivity? You find that in the 10-year rolling periods, all but one, that was the case. So all but one of the 8 periods between 10-year periods between 1929 and now, we've had both productivity gains and employment growth. If you take even shorter periods, you say, well, 10 years is too long and a lot happens in the intervening periods. We've also went back even to just looking at annual periods. So annually, how many instances in the 8 years have we had both productivity gains and employment growth at the national level? We actually find that of the 80 periods, 69 of them had both productivity gains and employment growth. So you'll find that at least at the national level, empirically, the evidence here does not suggest that you have this trade-off between jobs and productivity growth. By the way, some of you may be interested to see which was the 1-year period, the single 10-year period when we had when it went the other way, and that was roughly in the 1940s. By the way. So I think we find that empirically at the national level, it's just simply not true that there's this trade-off. Now, having said that, I think if you looked at this on a sector-by-sector basis, you do see some shifts, because what happens is as employment goes up in one sector, people shift into other new sectors. In a very dynamic economy, there's always reallocation of people and workforce and talent between different sectors. But at the national level, we find that productivity and growth tend to go hand in hand. You might even if you took an even shorter view, so before in the previous chart, we were looking at this on different periodic annual basis. If you looked at this even on a quarter-by-quarter basis, we went back and looked all the way back to 1949 to say, 47, to say, when have we had instances on a 2-quarter basis when we've had productivity and employment growth? And the correlation is very, very strong, indicating that even on a even shorter basis, 2 quarters in this case, for the most part, i.e. 71% of cases, you do have this strong correlation between productivity growth and employment, but with a couple of quarter lag. So we find that, again, there's a strong linkage between productivity growth and actually employment growth over time. But I think there's a cautionary tale to be told, having said all that. And it becomes quite stark when you look at the decade of the 90s and contrast that with the 2000s. And this goes to the point to make the observation that productivity gains are not just about efficiency. So we like the 90s. The 90s was a period in which we think the empirical evidence suggests that you had both growth in value-added output, if you think about which is the numerator of the productivity equation, as well as some efficiency gains, which is the denominator, which gives you a productivity jump. And at the same time, for the most part, we had employment growth. So this was a period when we think we had a terrific sort of virtuous cycle of companies and the economy innovating, increasing value-added output, becoming more efficient, driving productivity growth, as well as employment and GDP growth. So it was a terrific virtuous cycle. If you contrast that with the 2000s, in the 2000s is a slightly different picture. It looks as if we got most of our productivity gains from improving efficiency, as opposed to also driving as much of the value-added output increases, which is the numerator. Because keep in mind, it's a mathematical thing, right? You've got a numerator and denominator. You ideally want to work on both to get productivity gains. But in the 2000s, we mostly got our productivity gains from efficiency. So at some level, it's no surprise if you're a worker living in some of these sectors that mostly got productivity out of efficiency-driven improvements, that it might have felt as if there was a real trade-off between employment growth and productivity. So I think what we would, and the story is repeated as you go through the different sectors, what we would advocate, obviously, is that you want both efficiency and innovation, which typically drives value-added output, which increases the numerator and gives you the virtuous cycle that you want from productivity. The other important finding that's come from our work looking at productivity, and McKinsey Global Institute we've been doing sort of studies of productivity over the last 20 years, looking at multiple economies as well as sectors. And what we find in general, and also specifically for the US, is that we think there are actually productivity opportunities for both what you might call laggard sectors, as well as even the leading sectors. Laggard sectors defined as maybe sectors that haven't contributed as much to productivity, and the leading sectors meaning the ones that have been kind of perennial productivity leaders. And it's first just to give you a sense of the productivity contributions, at least in the recent period, across sectors. First, you find that, at least in this last decade, the top 5 sectors basically accounted for nearly 2/3, actually 3/4 of the productivity growth. So, you look at sectors like, real estate, you could argue that was a bubble sector, but you also have wholesale, manufacturing, and computer electronics and information. Those are kind of they made big contributions. These kind of made, if you like, middling contributions, and then you have the ones that actually had negative contributions to productivity. But what we find as we go through each of these, and you look at these sector by sector, so take the case of, say, manufacturing. Even though manufacturing has been quite consistently over many decades, been a strong productivity contributor, even within manufacturing, you find that there are still opportunities for even more improvement. So, for example, one industry that's interesting within the manufacturing sector is aerospace. The aerospace industry, has not even fully taken on board a combination of lean manufacturing, a lot of the innovations that have happened in other parts of manufacturing that could actually drive productivity of even the aerospace industry, for example. You take examples like wholesale. Wholesale was, if you'd gone back to the 90s, made huge contributions to productivity. Same thing in this last period, made big contributions. Yet you find that, for example, innovations such as cross-docking, the use of information technology, have not even fully penetrated that sector. So if you look at the, just even penetration rates, there's still lots of room to adopt best practices and some of the innovations that have occurred. So even in a sector like wholesale that's made big contributions, we still find lots of headroom for additional contributions. Then, of course, you've got sectors that have been relatively challenged in productivity terms at the bottom, healthcare, education, and so forth. And even there, we're quite hopeful. So all the research and case studies that we've done looking at even sectors like healthcare, we find a lot of opportunity for productivity gains, ranging from even more usage of information technology, for example, taking lessons learned from the less regulated sectors and applying them. So for example, take things like claims processing, for example. We know that industries like the insurance industry, as in kind of personal casualty insurance, have done incredible innovations in how do you accelerate the process of just managing, for example, insurance claims. And a lot of those best practices could also be adopted, for example, in sectors like healthcare, because they have analogies. There are analogous processes that those sectors go through. And so we find that, the laggard sectors now, through a combination, hopefully, increased competition, adoption of, for example, information technology, and even best practices of how to organize tasks and activities that have been borrowed, that can be borrowed from other sectors, also have a lot of productivity opportunities ahead of them. By the way, I should probably comment at this point about, I mentioned before that we've looked at probably over 30 industries in 20 countries around the world. And there seems to be a set of factors that are quite important that you often find that are associated with what leads to productivity. And those typically include, you find that highly competitive industries is a big contributing factor to productivity. You find that, for example, the adoption and use of information technology, again, combined with process changes and other associated changes, also make a big difference. We also find that anytime you have a very large sector even make small improvements, that actually matters a lot. And that's particularly important in this case, because if you can have a sector like healthcare even make small improvements in productivity, the impact on the wider economy is actually very substantial, just because of the size of that sector. I mean, we saw that, for example, in retail and wholesale in the 90s and the 2000s, that even small changes that those large sectors made had big impact on productivity gains. We also find, as a characteristic of what drives productivity, is that anytime you've got a sector that actually typically has globally competitive companies, that also makes a big difference, because what happens is usually companies that are exposed to global competition often have to innovate at an even faster rate than perhaps companies that are potentially, if you like, protected, locally protected. So all of those are some of the factors that we've found over time, that whenever many of those are true, you can get productivity gains. Let me shift to say, so given all of that, we set up a daunting productivity challenge at the beginning, and we've looked at sectors almost bottoms up to see where is there headroom and opportunity. Then the question is, can the U.S. actually achieve and meet its challenge? We actually think it can, but that comes with a caveat. But let me talk about why we think that the U.S. can meet this. So if you keep in mind that there's a bogey or target that we set up at the beginning about what we think we ought to try and achieve, and then you go through all the piece parts of that to say, okay, so where can that come from? First of all, we'll get something from increases in population, but then we'll get a little bit of a depression, if you like, when you factor into account even though we have increases in population, what does that really mean in terms of working population and the kind of the labor dynamics? We get a bit of a drop. But then if you look at, okay, so where's productivity going to come from bottoms up? We actually find that by looking at to what extent have different sectors adopted best practices. Again, keep in mind, as I described, that there's in any sector you'll find that there are always more productive companies or organizations than others. If everybody adopted commonly accepted kind of best practices, how much more of a bump could you get from that? And here we're not even assuming that everybody does, but it is a reasonable proportion based on history. You'll get some bump from that. If you then also look at some of the newer innovations, because keep in mind that both the companies in these sectors, as well as even the technologies and mechanisms that they use, are constantly innovating and changing. How much more of a bump up would you get from that? And you actually get a substantial amount from that. And there's a lot of kind of bottoms-up empirical evidence for that. So that gets you probably to 3/4 of the kind of gains that you need. And then you say, well, where else can you get other improvements? The next bump up you could get is around labor utilization. I made a point about this earlier, which is to say, even though we don't have favorable demographics in the way that a young, relatively young developing economy might have, there's still opportunities to improve labor participation rates. I'll give you a few very specific examples. If you look at for example, at women in the economy, the U.S. is still not yet at the kind of participation rates that, say, some of the European countries actually have. So if particularly the northern European countries, so if the U.S. could get women participation rates up quite a bit, that would actually improve things. And now there's a whole set of things that go with that, such as how do you provide other factors like childcare and welfare and a whole bunch of factors that contribute and make it easy for women to participate. But if you could get to those levels, that would contribute to that. If you also got the kind of senior participation rates in the economy that, again, other countries have been able to get, that also would contribute quite a bit to this. So we think that there's some potential additional gains from just thinking about this labor and worker participation rate question. We also think that there's some bump, and here we're being very modest, and hopefully, will be proven to have been very conservative in hindsight. But we actually think that there's a big bump that can come from relatively regulated sectors. So parts of the economy that have been laggard and relatively regulated. So I think healthcare and education in particular, just because they're so large. And we think that if you could spur change, either regulatorily or adoption of technology or changes, this is quite a modest gain. In fact, it could actually have been quite high. In fact, when we've worked with other economists, they actually think we're being very modest about what this number could actually be, by the way. So maybe we need to change our expectations, but we want it to be relatively conservative. But all of this suggests to us that we think it's actually quite possible with relatively modest assumptions. However, and this is the but in all of this, we think there's actually a lot of work that needs to happen for any of that to actually come true. And let me just step through some of these. As I mentioned, the relatively the kind of the public and relatively regulated sectors are a big part of this picture. Any change, any small changes in those sectors will actually make a big difference. And we think there's got to be a pretty focused agenda to say, how do we really change the productivity, performance, and trajectory of those large, relatively regulated sectors? Second, we think it's important to, as we say here, reinvigorate the innovation economy. How this links to productivity is really important. Again, keep in mind, as I said, productivity is a very straightforward equation. You want to improve the numerator, which is the value-added output from the economy, and that only comes through innovation. You don't, simply driving efficiency gains won't get you that. You need to actually have an economy that innovates. That's the only way you increase the value-added output, because if you're innovating and you're building products and services that people actually want, and they're competitive both locally and globally, that increases the numerator and the value-added output in the economy, and that requires innovation. And I think in many ways the rates of investments and encouragement and incentives for investments in R&D and innovation have not been what they could be in the U.S. economy lately. So we think this actually matters a lot. Second, we think that there's again, this notion of fully tapping into the talent pools in the U.S. economy and kind of developing talent and leveraging the full capacity of the U.S. population is really important. Because one of the things that is interesting is as you look at the industries and the sectors that are growing over the next decade or two, and you look at the mix of skills that are going to be required, there's a bit of a mismatch between the talent profile in the U.S. economy and the kind of the skill requirements. You only have to look at, for example, what the makeup is going to be required around the so-called STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And they're a big part of what the economy is going to need, and yet the rate at which the economy is preparing the talent pool for those industries isn't quite what it should be. You look at some of the issues that I described around fully tapping into the participation rates, so that's around for women still, and even older workers, we're not fully tapping that. So we think there's an important agenda item here around fully tapping the talent pool. Infrastructure really matters. There have been multiple studies by us and others which basically point to this linkage between the importance of an advanced and forward-looking infrastructure that creates and encourages investments that drive productivity. So, for example, we know that anytime you have a very good broadband transportation infrastructure, it actually contributes to productivity. We also know that an attractive infrastructure attracts the participation of very competitive companies. In some other work we've done where we spend time, for example, talking to some of the largest and also the most innovative companies in the U.S., this is in a previous study that we published last year, one of the factors that most companies, the most largest and also the most competitive companies described as a factor in how they decide where in the world they participate and invest in was actually the infrastructure as an important consideration. As they look at the whole global landscape, say where they're going to invest and participate. So we think this is important. We also think number 5 is important, partly because the business environment, the regulatory environment, the regulatory environment is also important just to, as it is linked to improving the performance of these sectors. But it's also important from the point of view of attracting, again, the most attractive, competitive, and dynamic companies to your economy. So we think that having this in place and really thinking about how does the public and the policymakers really engage with business to create the most attractive business and regulatory environment to drive growth and innovation, we think is really important. We haven't talked much about the energy productivity challenge, but there's between quite aside from the not to downplay the environmental concerns, which are obviously very, very important. Even if you didn't care about that, we actually find that just having a more productive energy sector that actually is using efficient technology is really, really important economically and actually contributes to productivity growth. So by working on number 6, you get the combination of doing the right things for the environment, obviously, but also just a significant contribution to the way the economy works. So we think that's important. And then finally, and we haven't talked much about this just in the interest of time, but even within the U.S., we actually find that there's some important, interesting differences regionally and between cities, where we think regions and cities have a lot to learn from each other in terms of just best practice. Because if you look at the productivity performance of different regions in the country, as well as cities, many of those cannot simply be explained by size or the location of industries. Yeah, there's some of that can be explained by just the industries and the companies that are in different sectors, but that doesn't explain all of it. There are just some other differences that have to do with just how those regional and city economies work that I think cities can learn and regions can learn from each other to drive productivity. That's all I had to cover. Sorry, I covered a lot of ground probably quite quickly, but I'll hand back to Michael.
Well, thank you, James. For those of you who have joined us online, we've been listening to James Manyika, Director of McKinsey Global Institute, talking about their new report, Growth and Renewal, Retooling America's Economic Engine.